Hey guys, tonight we slip back in time to a moment when the air itself felt dangerous to breathe. You're in a narrow street, the cobblestone slick with something you don't want to name. The stench of vinegar, rotting onions, and unspoken dread clinging to your clothes. Somewhere close, a church bell tolls not for worship, but for another body cart rumbling past. And yet, just ahead, under a crooked balcony draped in black fabric, a woman drops a folded parchment down to a man waiting below. He catches it. Without touching her fingers, slips it into his coat, and looks up smiling. Somehow, in this mess of fleas and fevers and priests, chanting last rites like Spotify's top 10, love is still happening. Not just happening, thriving. That's right. In the worst possible conditions, people were falling in love like their lives depended on it, which they kind of did. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And drop your location and what time you're listening in the comments. I want to know who else is up late, wondering how Plague-era people managed to flirt without FaceTime. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background. And let's ease into tonight's journey together. You don't expect romance when there are piles of dead bodies outside the bakery. But here you are, creeping through a medieval city with a mask of dried herbs strapped to your face, your breath fogging up the inside. The streets are deserted, except for the occasional blur of a figure darting past, cape flapping like a bat. You're delivering a message maybe, or sneaking out to meet someone who makes your stomach flutter, despite the open sores on their neck. Historians still argue whether plague conditions made people more desperate for connection, or just less picky, but either way, records show something strange. More marriages, more births, and way more forbidden trysts. Love didn't stop when death walked the streets, it got louder. Take, for example, the French courtiers of the 17th century who fled to the countryside to avoid infection, and ended up playing more adult games than any medical quarantine recommended. One duchess wrote in her diary about limbs entangled like roots in rooms where the curtains never opened. And not for fresh air, mind you. You get the sense that fear stripped people down to their hungriest instincts. Eat, sleep, love, repeat. But it wasn't all reckless hookups. Some of it was strangely tender. Picture a young man, let's call him Matteo, sneaking across rooftops in Florence. He's dodging guards, yes, but also avoiding his infected uncle who's downstairs moaning into a bowl of garlic soup. Matteo has one goal, to see his neighbor Lucetta, who plays the lute at her window. They've never touched. But every night she plays, and he listens, scribbling sonnets by candlelight. They fall in love across an alley, trading poems and smiles while the world below seems to burn. When Lucetta finally disappears for 3 days, Matteo is wrecked. On the 4th night, her sister appears instead and tosses down a note. She is not dead. She waits on the roof. You can guess where that goes: nervous kisses under the stars, fevered whispers, and maybe 1 or 2 slightly ill-advised choices. What's weird is how often Plague-era love stories seem ... cinematic. Like something from a tragic YA novel where half the characters are terminal. But this wasn't fiction. These were real people clinging to beauty in the ugliest time imaginable. It's also when some truly bizarre cultural habits cropped up, like the use of dried crocodile dung as a romantic perfume alternative. Yes, apparently, nothing says, "I adore you," like a warm sack of prehistoric poop under the armpit. Or the popular belief that kissing a leper's hand could purify your soul, assuming you didn't lose your own in the process. Still, those little acts of affection, weird as they sound, were forms of intimacy. They were the 14th century, equivalent of sexting through a locked door. Even the ruling elite weren't immune to this plague-borne passion. Catherine the Great, yes, the one with the horses, though that part's a lie, wrote feverish love letters to her advisors during cholera outbreaks, describing how loneliness sinks into the bones more painfully than any illness. And in Sex with Kings, Eleanor Herman recounts how royal mistresses were often moved into isolated villas during plague seasons, where kings would visit them secretly under the cover of darkness, risking infection just to hold a familiar waist in the moonlight. One French king even disguised himself as a common doctor to sneak into his lover's quarantined quarters. What she thought of this isn't recorded, but odds are it was either very sexy or extremely confusing. The oddest part? Love during plague wasn't always tragic. Sometimes it worked. People met, bonded, stayed together, not in spite of the horror, but because of it. In the same way war veterans sometimes form unbreakable bonds in foxholes, lovers in plague years forge connections that ordinary time never could. Maybe it's the adrenaline, or the constant reminder that nothing's guaranteed, that any moment could be your last. And if that's true, why wouldn't you reach for someone's hand? Now you're locked inside with someone who might be the love of your life, or might be chewing too loudly for you ever love again. Quarantine in the Middle Ages wasn't just about staying safe. It was about being stuck in a house the size of your modern bathroom, with no plumbing, one shared bed, and the subtle ambient soundtrack of rats dying in the walls. You learn a lot about a person when neither of you can leave for 40 days. That's actually where the word quarantine comes from, 40 giorni, Italian for 40 days, originally used in Venice to keep potentially infected ships floating offshore, with no contact except shouted arguments and thrown bread. Now apply that to a one-room hovel and a recently betrothed couple. No wedding night escape to the countryside. Just a clay pot, 2 lice-ridden wool blankets, and a goat that won't stop watching. And somehow, against all odds, people bonded. Not in the cutesy TikTok dance way, but in the way trauma sometimes accelerates intimacy. You have to laugh when you realize that quarantine couples isn't just a modern phrase, it's a medieval cliché. Court records from the late 1500s show a spike in annulments after quarantine ended. Irreconcilable differences, they'd say, though the margin notes often included things like snored like a drowning pig or refused to bathe despite strong suggestion. Still, not all of them fell apart. Some grew deeper roots, the kind of love that forms in silence, in routine, in shared dread. Picture a couple in Paris, 1628. Jean, a cooper who used to make wine barrels, now boils his tools every morning and listens for coughing from the neighbors. His wife, Marguerite, peels onions obsessively, not because she's cooking anything, but because someone told her onion peels absorb bad air. At night, they sit by candlelight and read psalms together. Not because they're devout, but because the rhythm of the words calms their nerves. And slowly, between dried bread and cold tea, they start to talk. Not the shallow kind. How was your day? Doesn't hit the same when every day involves counting plague pustules. But the real stuff. Regrets. Childhood memories. What they'd name a child if they had one. One night, he touches her hand and it feels like a new kind of fire. That hand becomes the entire universe. Historians still argue whether these enforced domestic pairings led to stronger marriages or just temporarily suppressed murder statistics. But diaries and letters from the period show a remarkable uptick. In emotional honesty, people got vulnerable. Stripped of distractions, they turned toward each other. Sometimes what they found was horrifying. But sometimes it was the first real connection they'd had in years. Of course, not everyone quarantined with their beloved. Some folks used isolation as an excuse to get creative. In 17th century Prague, a wealthy merchant named Gustav kept his mistress hidden in his wine cellar, claiming she was inventory. His wife never suspected a thing until the mistress accidentally drank all the Riesling and started singing sea shanties through the vent. She was promptly evicted, but not before penning what might be the first known passive-aggressive love poem on the back of a wine invoice. It ends with, I hope your wife kisses like vinegar and your grapes rot before harvest. Iconic. And it wasn't just illicit lovers finding ways to be together. In Spain, lovebirds used elaborate pulley systems to send gifts and letters between balconies. Think Romeo and Juliet, but with plague masks and cheese wheels dangling from ropes. One noble woman sent her suitor a live parrot with a ribbon around its neck reading "My heart beats in exile." The parrot, tragically, did not survive the week, but the sentiment. Immaculate. There's also the case of a Japanese samurai during a 1720 smallpox epidemic who, unable to visit his betrothed, carved her face into a cherrywood statue and kissed it daily. When questioned, he simply replied, "My love cannot be quarantined." He was fined heavily for disrespecting the ancestors, but the statue was later recovered worn smooth around the lips. Sweet? Creepy? Yes. Sex stories, though, don't take a vacation either. In Peter Webb's The Erotic Spirit Through History, there's a passage about an isolated couple in plague era Naples who reportedly made love so often their landlord filed a noise complaint through the local priest. The priest, upon visiting, decided to simply bless the house and leave, muttering that perhaps love is a cure. Of course, the man died 3 days later, but his widow claimed he went smiling. And somewhere under all of it, the sweating walls, the tick of infected time, the long, terrifying silences, there's this unkillable human impulse to reach out, to touch, to love, because the alternative is to feel nothing. And feeling nothing, in an age where death feels everything, is far worse. The mask slips slightly as you lean in closer, not just to breathe, but to see who's behind that peacock-feathered disguise. You're at a plague-era masquerade ball, but not the Disney kind. The year is 1630, and you've been invited to a private gathering in Venice. Outside, the air reeks of salt, incense, and cremation ash. Inside, there's silk, music, and perfume so strong it could knock a rat dead. Everyone wears a mask, not just for anonymity, but to keep out the miasma, bad air said to carry death. That mask, with its long bird-like beak stuffed full of lavender and clove, becomes more than medical gear. It's a costume, a filter, a flirtation. Behind every disguise is a heart-playing chicken with fate. You dance because you don't know if you'll see tomorrow. And there, between one harpsichord trill and another, you lock eyes with someone who, despite smelling faintly of garlic vinegar, just might be your undoing. Masquerades weren't invented during the plague, but they evolved. What started as elite entertainment became acts of defiance dancing in the jaws of death. Picture it. Candlelit halls full of laughter while outside, corpses stack like firewood. It's absurd. It's decadent. It's deeply human. Historians still argue whether these parties were acts of denial or catharsis. Probably both. But they served a purpose, reminding people that they were still alive. And if they were going to go, they'd go in velvet and pearls, locked in someone else's arms. Now the sex part? Oh, it happened. Read Eleanor Herman's Sex with Kings, and you'll stumble across stories like that of Duke Vincenzo of Mantua, who reportedly hosted quarantine masquerades. During plague years, guests would arrive in masks, sanitized with wine. Yes, wine, and end the night in confession booths that were actually elaborately disguised shag rooms. One lover wrote that she couldn't tell who she'd kissed until the mask came off, and by then, she no longer cared. Romance during a pandemic often danced that line between thrilling and reckless. But here's the strange thing. Being masked wasn't a turn-off. It was seductive, a tease. In an era where physical deformities were common, thanks, smallpox and disease-bloated faces beyond recognition, the mask became an equalizer. Everyone was a mystery. Everyone was potentially beautiful. One fringe detail people forget. Plague masks were sometimes accessorized. Tassels, embroidery, gold trim like tricked-out gas masks. In Venice, it became trendy to spritz perfume inside. The beak before entering a party, so your breath came out scented like rosewater or frankincense. If you were lucky, someone might lean close and murmur, "Your breath is divine," not realizing they were complimenting a clove sachet sewn in by your maid. But you'd still blush. You'd still feel that little zing of being wanted. And then there's the music. Imagine a quartet playing a somber waltz while two strangers, both unsure whether they're contagious, hover inches apart. You can't see mouths, just eyes, expressive, searching eyes. In a time when so much was hidden boils under sleeves, terror behind stoic faces, those eyes became entire conversations. Some couples reportedly wore gloves with embroidered initials so they could touch and still signal affection. Others used coated ribbons, colored to indicate status. Red for mourning, blue for betrothed, green for available but might be dying soon. Let's talk about one famous pair, Caterina and Leone, two minor nobles in Rome who met at a masked ball thrown during the 1656 outbreak. She wore a black mask with silver embroidery. He wore a doctor's beak painted gold. They never spoke, just danced 3 times in near silence. Afterward, he left a note in her carriage. "If we both live, I will find you." A week later, she fell ill. When she recovered, he was gone. She never saw him again. But she wore that mask to every carnival. After hoping, she married eventually, but never danced again. Why does this hit so hard? Maybe because even in the most grotesque circumstances, humans crave the aesthetic, the moment, the connection. And these massed gatherings, these reckless displays of joy, let people step outside reality, just for a night, just long enough to pretend they weren't terrified. Peter Webb, in The Erotic Spirit Through History, suggests that these masked encounters offered a kind of safe zone physically and emotionally. You could act out fantasies, confess affections, even kiss a stranger, all while maintaining plausible deniability. "It wasn't me," you might say the next day. "I was someone else." And in a way, you were. Grief makes people reach for masks. Fear does too. But love? Love slips underneath. By the end of the night, your fingers are intertwined with someone else's. Sweat collecting under your mask, music fading. The city beyond these candlelit walls is dying. But inside, for one impossible hour, it feels like living has never been more vivid. You step into a narrow alley and hear moaning, not the dying kind, but the kind that raises eyebrows. A painted door creaks open, just enough for a hand to slip out, fingers beckoning. The brothel is still open, of course it is. The world might be ending, but business? Thriving. You duck inside and suddenly you're not in a city of plague. You're in a velvet-walled escape pod. Perfume thick as fog clings to the curtains. Lit candles drip like slow honey, and laughter giddy, tipsy, slightly manic bubbles up from somewhere. Behind a curtain, in here, morality holds its breath. Plague didn't kill lust, it just relocated it. Sex workers in the time of plague didn't shut down shop, they evolved. They wore amulets of crushed sapphire, bathed in rose vinegar, and offered services with a prayer to Saint Roch taped under the mattress. Historians still argue whether these bordellos acted as vectors for disease or unexpected hubs of emotional therapy. Either way, they were busy. The same priests who condemned fornication during sermons were often found, half-drunk, sneaking out the back doors of bathhouses, blaming their red cheeks on the wine, not the company. The church, ever inventive, issued contradictory messages. Avoid sin, but also confess often. Repentance became a punch card. You could rack up indulgences and still rack up partners. In cities like Avignon, courtesans developed whole new rituals. Clients were asked to wash their hands in citrus wine, kiss a small wooden cross, and lie still while the madam whispered a protection blessing over their naked backs. Did it work? Absolutely not. But it made them feel safer, like sanitizer with extra foreplay. One madam reportedly hired an astrologer to chart her girl's star signs for compatibility and divine infection days, which sounds ridiculous until you realize that same astrologer charged double during full moons and no one complained. People were desperate. Not just for sex, but for touch. For intimacy. For a moment where someone looked at you like you mattered, even if you smelled faintly of pickled onions and despair. Take the case of Madame Isabeau's house in Lyon, 1353. She ran what she called a house of cleansing pleasures. Patrons paid not just for a lover, but for a ritual. The room was smoked with pine resin, hands were washed in heated wine, and before anything began, the pair shared a spoonful of honey to sweeten the breath before sharing it, she claimed. The sex was reportedly tender, slow, and full of whispered fears. One soldier wrote in a letter, "I touched her not to conquer, but to remember I was not yet a ghost." That letter is now in a museum, and it smells faintly of murder. And then there were the loopholes, the religious kind. Plague panics brought about the phenomenon of temporary marriages, a sort of spiritual contract, where two people could wed for the duration of illness and dissolve the union after. These mini-marriages allowed physical closeness under the guise of morality. Convenient, no? One Italian bishop referred to them as holy arrangements for temporary consolation. One woman referred to them, more bluntly, as the best week of her life. There's also the wild case of the monastery near Krakow, where monks and nuns officially quarantined were found weeks later to have converted their chapel into a shared dormitory, citing liturgical proximity therapy. The scandal exploded. The Pope condemned it. Local peasants gossiped for months. And yet, some of those illicit pairings endured even after the quarantine lifted. A few even left the clergy and married. Not everyone was seeking salvation. Some just wanted someone to hold their hand in the dark dot in the history of sexuality. Michel Foucault notes that plagues tend to crack open power structures, and in those cracks, desire rushes in. When rules break, instincts speak louder. In cities under lockdown, the rules of class blurred. Nobles snuck into commoner brothels. Beggars fell in love with bankers' widows. Hierarchies wilted in the fever heat of shared mortality. When you both wear masks, when you both might die tomorrow, does it matter who has a title? One fringe tidbit. In Hungary, a certain brothel offered plague survivors a discount. Show your scar. Get half off. It was called the Mark of Mercy deal. Another in Bavaria served clients under a strict 2-minute limit, claiming anything longer increased breath exposure. Clients lined up anyway, and still, amid the absurdity, there were moments of grace. A prostitute named Celeste in Bordeaux reportedly refused payment from a coffin poet who'd lost everything. She sat with him, read his verses aloud, and let him cry into her lap. "You remind me," she said, "that not all love is paid for." He died the next day. She lit a candle for him, kissed the parchment of his last sonnet, and went back to work, because the world didn't stop. The city didn't pause. And love, messy, inconvenient, transactional, real, kept crawling forward like ivy through cracks in stone. Not always pure, but always, always human. The priest is coughing. Not politely, not discreetly. He's hacking up something that sounds like a wet wool sock being wrung out over a fire. And you're standing there holding hands with someone you barely know. Whisper in vows faster than a scam auctioneer. Welcome to deathbed marriages equal parts romance, desperation, and logistical nightmare. When the plague hits, the pace of love speeds up like a dodgy TikTok relationship. You meet, you talk, you maybe touch elbows, and if you both haven't dropped dead by lunch, someone's proposing. In normal times, marriage is about dowries and alliances, long courtships, and second opinions from your aunt. But during plague outbreaks, it becomes about legal rights, inheritance, witnesses, a final grasp at control before the world eats itself. Picture a young woman named Elsbeth in Nuremberg, 1521. Her father is dying. She's engaged to a merchant who's been courting her by candle flicker for weeks. As the priest nears the end of the sermon, her father starts convulsing. The priest skips 3 paragraphs, pronounces them married, and 10 seconds later, the inheritance shifts to Elsbeth's new husband, who's already calculating interest rates in his head. Love? Maybe, but legal urgency? Absolutely dot, and still, it wasn't all transactional. Sometimes the rush made room for something weirdly pure. When you're staring death in the face, you either lock up or open wide. One Parisian couple reportedly met while evacuating the same tenement. They fought over a bucket of grain, then shared it. That night, huddled in a stable, they declared each other husband and wife in front of 3 equally homeless witnesses and a goat. 2 weeks later, she died. He buried her under a flowering vine and spent the rest of the outbreak telling anyone who'd listen she was the love of his life. Historians still argue whether these last-minute bonds should be treated as real marriages or emergency measures. But if you define marriage as 2 people choosing each other in a moment of truth, well, these moments were full of truth. Sex, of course, didn't wait for paperwork. In Sex with Kings, Eleanor Herman recounts how royal courts during plague. Waves would suddenly allow mistresses to visit noblemen on their sickbeds. One dying duke even requested to be married mid-thrust. He believed climax would carry his soul faster to heaven. The priest refused. The mistress, reportedly, did not. Meanwhile, across Europe, broadsheets were full of legal advice for how to handle plagued unions. If a couple exchanged rings before symptoms appeared, the church often considered it binding. If the ring exchange happened during fever, dicey. If it happened during hallucinations involving angels and boiling frogs, null and void. One particularly romantic example. In 1603, during London's plague panic, a woman named Judith pregnant, and unwed rushed to the city gates to find the baby's father. He'd been taken to the pest house the night before. She bribed the guards, snuck in wearing vinegar-soaked rags, and found him barely conscious. She proposed. He blinked once for yes. A friendly washerwoman served as priest, ring, and witness. He died an hour later. She named the child Hope. That there were practical reasons for these unions, of course. Wives could inherit property. Husbands could claim land or titles. A marriage certificate meant access to pensions, safer burial rights, even reduced quarantine. Penalties. But for many, it also offered a final sense of belonging. To be someone's something before the curtain dropped. To sign your name beside another's and know in some cosmic way, you didn't die alone. And even among the bizarre legalities, love stories flowered like mold on damp parchment. There's the tale of 2 scribes in Florence who married by letter. While quarantined in separate city blocks, he passed his vows through a network of candle makers and apothecaries. She replied with a pressed flower wrapped in wax paper and a note that read, "My heart waits where your ink dries." They never met in person again, but both signed married on their census forms the following year. Fringe tidbit here, some towns had traveling deathbed notaries, men who specialized in rushing from house to house during outbreaks, writing up last-minute marriages, wills, and love declarations. They were paid in bread, candles, or sometimes hugs if the family was brave. One such notary, Master Filippo of Milan, recorded over 600 plague marriages in 1349 alone. His journal reads like a tragic sitcom. Bride fainted. Groom's ring too small. Witness sneezed, entire wedding dispersed. And yet, beneath the chaos, something real kept sparking. The moment when 2 people, each terrified, looked at each other and said, "If we have nothing else, let's have this. Let's claim each other before the world erases us." Not for society, not for legacy, just for now. And sometimes that was enough. A handshake in a candlelit room. A whispered yes. A kiss that tasted like cloves and fear. You're holding a letter in your hand, still warm from the iron tongs that delivered it. It smells faintly of vinegar and wax. The paper crackles when you open it, edges singed from being passed over a candle flame standard plague protocol. But inside, the words pulse like a heartbeat. My beloved, it begins, I dream of your voice more than I fear my fever. In an age where even breathing the same air might kill you, the love letter becomes sacred, equal parts romance, risk, and resilience. Forget texting. Forget even eye contact. In plague time, intimacy is outsourced to ink and messengers in bird masks. And yes, sometimes those letters are carried by corpse collectors, because they're already going door to door. Convenient, if morbid. These love notes, smuggled in pies, sewn into hems, folded like secret origami, become lifelines. Little pockets of hope in a world wrapped in black cloth. Historians still argue whether this surge in romantic correspondence marks the birth of modern love letters or just a desperate spasm of emotional survival. But the volume is undeniable. From merchant daughters in Amsterdam to poets in Cairo, everyone is writing, pouring their hearts into pages because it's the only way to touch someone without touching them. Take Lucia and Tomas, two lovers in plague-stricken Seville, 1649. They'd met once, briefly, in the cathedral's shadow. He tipped his hat. She offered a glance. Then the lockdown hit. For weeks, they exchanged letters through the local baker, who baked them into loaves. Tomas's first letter simply said, I watched the pigeons because they reminded me of you, flighty and free. Lucia's reply included a tiny pressed daisy and the line, if I die, I hope it's while reading your words. They never married, but their letters survived, and they're heartbreaking. They read like two people carving a love story out of distance, illness, and bread flour. There's something hauntingly cinematic about this, two people who can't be together, yet write as if they're already one breath away. The kind of longing that builds not from physical closeness, but from total separation. Your lover is a rumor wrapped in ribbon, a heartbeat echoed in ink. And when the letter finally arrives, you don't just read it, you absorb it. Line by line, as if it contains antibodies for loneliness. In The Erotic Spirit Through History, Peter Webb notes that letter writing in plague times wasn't just about passion, it was about memory. To write to someone was to make them real, to be remembered even if your body was gone. One Venetian widow kept every letter her husband ever wrote, even after he died in quarantine. She read one each day for years like a ritual until she herself passed. The letters were found neatly stacked, tied with silk, labeled The Days I Was Still Loved, and the courtiers. Oh, the unsung heroes of plague romance. Plague doctors and errand boys with extra gloves and iron rods, poking notes through doorways like forbidden's candy. Some even charged extra to recite love letters aloud at a safe distance, dramatic readings, complete with swoons and whispered inflections. One account from 1665 tells of a London man who hired an actor to perform his love letter as a monologue outside his beloved's window. She threw him a handkerchief. He caught it. The actor cried. That's art. There's a fringe case from Krakow where a young couple, unable to risk physical delivery, developed a code using colored laundry. A blue shirt meant I miss you. A white sheet meant I'm unwell. A red ribbon tucked into a sleeve said, meet me in the orchard at dusk. Eventually, the entire neighborhood caught on and started adding their own meanings, until plague laundry became an unspoken symphony of longing, gossip, and hope flapping in the wind. Of course, not all letters were romantic. Some were desperate, angry, even absurd. One woman in Marseille wrote her ex a furious note during quarantine, listing every reason he was unfit for continued affection, including, your snoring sounds like Satan gargling soup. She ended with, I'd rather kiss a plague rat than you, warmly Genevieve. Iconic, but most were gentler, hopeful. The kind of letters written at 2 a.m. when the coughing won't stop and the walls feel too thin. You write not because it will save you, but because maybe, just maybe, it will carry some part of you forward. A line, a phrase, a heartbeat. In one particularly tragic case, a young nobleman in Warsaw wrote his beloved every day for 2 months. While quarantined, when he stopped writing, she feared the worst. But a week later, she received one final note, written in a shaky, fading hand. I saved my last words for you. I hope they find you warm and alive. If not, read them to the stars. She had it carved onto his tombstone. Visitors still leave roses. Because in the end, even when bodies couldn't meet, words could. Carried across danger, disinfected by flame, kissed into envelopes, and whispered into the darkness. Proof that even when the world is silent, love still speaks. The ceiling is cracked, the town square's on fire, and someone just sold you a painting of 2 naked lovers, riding a skeleton like it's a horse headed straight into hell. Welcome to Plague-era erotic art, where subtlety dies first. You'd think people would stop drawing nudes when death was literally dragging itself through the streets on 4 limbs and a prayer. But nope. They painted harder, loved harder, sculpted harder. There's something deliciously human about this instinct. When the body starts to betray you, you immortalize it. Capture it mid-gasp, mid-arch, mid-everything. Historians still argue whether this spike in erotic artwork was escapism, spiritual rebellion, or just rich people being bored and horny. Probably all 3. But the results? Haunting, vivid. You can stand in front of a fresco of 2 lovers wrapped in bedsheets as a demon, peers through the window, and feel something stir, not just lust, but recognition. That this was how people chose to be remembered. Not as saints, as sinners with good cheekbones. Let's take an actual piece. In 14th century Siena, a now faded tapestry once hung in a noblewoman's chamber, showing a woman and a man twined together in a garden full of dead roses, their mouths inches apart. Behind them, the Grim Reaper watches with almost fondness. It wasn't porn, it was prophecy, a love that outlasts the rot. That imagery, the intermingling of flesh and decay, became a whole aesthetic. Artists used gold leaf for body parts, and charcoal for disease, breasts next to bones, soft skin against crumbling architecture. Erotic love became defiance, not just of death, but of the rules that told people to hide it. And the church noticed. Cue the moral panic. In 17th century Prague, one bishop reportedly ordered the destruction of over 300 obscene images, including one particularly controversial etching of Saint Sebastian being comforted by a very naked, very muscular angel. Copies of this etching were hidden in bread loaves, wine barrels, and once true story sewn into the hem of a nun's robe. She claimed it was for private reflection. Icon.in, the erotic spirit through history. Peter Webb writes about a strange artistic trend called the deathbed embrace, where lovers are shown locked together in bed, surrounded by signs of plague-rotting fruit, dying candles, skeletal pets. These weren't warnings, they were wishes. To die with someone. To die while feeling alive. One painter, whose name we've lost, scrawled this in the margin of a sketch. If I cannot avoid death, let me meet it in her arms. Even amateur artists joined the wave. Love-sick teenagers in London scratched hearts and initials into wooden boards they disinfected with brandy. In Florence, there was a trend of sending lovers self-portraits painted onto bits of shell, tiny, vulnerable, and dangerously romantic. One girl mailed hers with a note. This is how I look when I imagine your hands. Her lover fainted. Or maybe he was just symptomatic. Hard to tell, but it wasn't just paintings. It was body art too. Tattoos, though not common, saw a curious spike. Sailors quarantined in harbors got hearts stabbed with daggers. Women inked initials onto their hips using berry juice and broken needles. A surviving recipe from Lübeck describes a homemade plague ink that supposedly kept you safe if applied during orgasm. Absolutely nothing about that was medically sound. But it spread anyway, like a rumor, like a prayer. Even literature joined in. Erotic poems flourished. Some scandalous, some shockingly sweet. In one 1625 poem found scrawled in the margins of a medical manual, a physician wrote, "Your pulse quickens mine. No tincture nor salve can compare to the press of your lips." The last line reads, "May we fever together and sweat out love." Gross? A little, but also kind of perfect. One fringe tidbit: a group of artists in Antwerp formed something called the Fevered Brush Society. Their goal: to capture lust and mortality in the same frame. Members pledged to paint one erotic piece per week, each containing a hidden skull. Most were destroyed during later purges, but a few survived quiet, scandalous acts of resistance hanging in dusty corners of European archives. Now picture yourself back in that crumbling studio. The candles flicker. The painter's hand trembles. Outside, the bells toll another death. But inside, two figures take shape on canvas, half undressed, half divine. They aren't running from death, they're staring it down, saying, "If this is the end, let it find us in each other's arms." Because when the body becomes dangerous, you don't stop loving it. You just love it louder. The fire's still smoldering when the music starts something between a drumbeat and a dare. You're standing at the edge of a makeshift clearing where once starched nobles now dance barefoot, wine-stained and fever-eyed, circling a bonfire. With the urgency of people who've already mourned too much to care. It's not a funeral. It's not a wedding. It's something messier, older. A kind of love riot. Welcome to the post-plague afterglow, where grief and lust mix like candle wax and blood. You'd think after years of sickness and silence, people might crave quiet. But what they want is noise, touch, laughter that sounds like weeping and kissing. That tastes like desperation. Historians still argue whether these wild gatherings, orgiastic feasts, barefoot dances, all-night cuddle fests were celebrations of survival or expressions of collective madness. But either way, they happened, and not on the fringes. In the center, right where the death pits had cooled. Picture a village in the south of France, 1350. The plague has passed. Not everyone made it, but you did. The bakery reopens. The wine is flowing, and suddenly someone suggests a feast. Not a religious one, not a state-sanctioned, somber banquet, but a full-blown, gluttonous, lusty free-for-all. The elders don't stop it. They bring more cheese. That night, couples form and reform. People cry, then laugh, then cry again. A priest strips off his cassock and cannonballs into a barrel of cider. Someone gets married in the middle of a pig chase. And in the background, two strangers are tangled under a wagon, whispering names they've only just exchanged. It's not tidy, but it's honest. When you've lived in fear for years, the return of freedom tastes like honey on raw skin. People made love like they were trying to repopulate the earth, because sometimes they were. Population records show sudden booms after plague years. Not just because of biological need, but because people missed each other, missed skin, missed weight and warmth and shared breathing. One diary from 1666 simply reads, "Today I held someone until the birds started again. I remembered I was alive, and it wasn't just young lovers. Widows, too, found their second or third flames. Old men danced with kitchen maids. Gravediggers wrote sonnets. Monks abandoned vows for women with laughter like lightning. Even nuns freed. From quarantines were known to sneak into these midnight celebrations, barefoot and grinning, cloaks hiding garlands in their hair. These weren't people ignoring death. These were people who'd stared it in the face and dared to keep living anyway. Sex, in these moments, was rarely tidy or romantic. It was noisy, sincere, bodies finding each other not out of desire alone, but recognition, like dogs returning to a favorite patch of sun. Peter Webb, in The Erotic Spirit Through History, describes it as mourning through motion, grief-driven pleasure. One woman in Lubeck reportedly whispered to her lover, "If death comes, let it find me smiling." That line, etched into the lintel of the town's rebuilt tavern. One particularly strange story. In Poland, a village that had lost nearly half its population held a festival of flesh at the end of their mourning year. Participants wore wreaths, drank honeyed beer, and swore oaths of temporary bonding. Anyone unpartnered by midnight was ceremonially kissed by the eldest widow in town, who, in this case, kissed 15 people in a row and later became a local legend. The town still celebrates her every spring. A fringe tidbit for you: archaeologists in southern Germany uncovered a skeleton clutching another in a shallow grave. Nothing strange there, except they were buried post-plague, arms intertwined, and around their necks was a charm inscribed with the phrase, "We died dancing." No church would have allowed that, which means someone buried them quietly, lovingly, exactly as they'd asked. And still, not all afterglow moments were carnal. Some were domestic, quiet, a pot of soup shared without fear, a child's laugh in a room that once echoed only with coughing. One couple planted a tree for every friend they'd lost. By the time they died, the orchard was so thick with blossoms, you couldn't walk through it without sneezing. They called it their forest of holding on. These final flames, the ashes, the feasts, the messy making of joy, weren't just emotional responses. They were survival tactics. A way to stitch something warm onto the edge of something cold. Because if plague-era lovers taught us anything, it's that the human spirit is wildly, stubbornly romantic, even while dying. Especially while dying, love didn't just endure the plague. It danced with it, masked, half-naked, laughing, and then it laid down beside it, wrapped arms around whoever was closest, and whispered, "One more night." End of script. Sweet dreams.